Lecture 2. The United States Constitution. Delegates from the 13 states were called to Philadelphia in the spring of 1787 with the purpose of amending the Articles of Confederation. 12 states and a total of 55 delegates. Rhode Island chose not to participate, and only 30 of the 55 delegates participated regularly. The delegates quickly realized that amending the Articles of Confederation was not going to work. They needed to devise an entirely new system of government. To prevent outside influences from interfering with the convention's work, the delegates met in closed sessions. The delegates slaved away throughout the summer drafting the new Constitution. The work was exhausting, the debates intense. In order to keep the convention's work a secret, doors and windows were kept locked, a fairly unpleasant thought in the hot and humid Philadelphia summer. Not only were the delegates deprived of a natural breeze, but fans and air conditioning were more than 100 years off. Moreover, consider men's fashion circa 1787, and the fact that daily bathing rituals were not commonplace. After 4 long months, the convention was over, and there was a new constitution. George Washington, the preeminent military hero of the time, was selected as the presiding officer of the convention. He did not actively participate in the convention debates, but all accounts suggest his presence was essential for the development of the document. Delegates were important men of their time, nearly all with practical experience in public affairs. However, you should keep in mind that some notable names of the time were not present. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were serving as ministers abroad. Samuel Adams was ill, and Patrick Henry refused to participate, as he thought the convention would lead to a new monarchy. The framers of the Constitution were well-read men. They were familiar with previous attempts to devise systems of self-government, and they were well aware of the failures of such attempts. The framers drew heavily upon history and classical political philosophers like John Locke, Rousseau, and Thomas Hobbes. For example, Hobbes argues that in a state of nature, without any form of government, individuals seek to protect their own lives, liberty, and property from those around them. Without government, the strong will take advantage of the weak, destroying the lives, liberty, and property of those who are unable to be aggressors themselves. Rousseau has a solution for this nasty state of nature. To protect each individual from all others, we choose to develop government. In return for protection, we give up a small piece of our liberty to a government of our choosing. We give up our right to extract vengeance, to kill, to take from those who are weaker, and in return, we get protection from those who are stronger. This is the essence of the social contract. To opt out of a social contract is to leave society altogether. The critical test, then, is to devise a government that is strong enough to preserve order, to keep everyone in line, but not so strong that it will destroy all of liberty. James Madison expresses this sentiment in the Federalist Papers when he writes, "You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself." Today we may assume that the logical solution is to have a democracy, but the delegates of the Constitutional Convention did not see it this way. Democracy at the time was associated with mob rule. They also did not want an aristocracy, a rule by a few elites. Instead, the framers went about to design a republic, a representative democracy. At the Constitutional Convention, the Virginia delegation offered a proposal on how to structure this new government. Known as the Virginia Plan, the delegation suggested that the new Constitution develop a stronger national government and argued that the national legislature should have the power to nullify state laws, making the national government much stronger than under the Articles of Confederation. The Virginians recommended 3 separate branches of government, including a bicameral legislature. The Virginia Plan called for one house of the national legislature to be directly elected by the people and the other to be indirectly elected. In 1787, Virginia was one of the largest states in terms of population and economic power. As such, it should come as no surprise that the Virginia Plan recommended that representation in the national legislature be determined on the basis of population. Not surprisingly, some of the smaller states objected to the Virginia Plan and believed that such a system would unfairly benefit large states over smaller ones. As a result, a second plan was proposed, the New Jersey Plan. The New Jersey Plan recommended that the convention modify the Articles of Confederation rather than draft an entirely new constitution. While the New Jersey delegation recognized the flaws of the Articles and the need for a stronger central government, they believed that modifying the Articles to include a small addition of strength was sufficient. The New Jersey plan also wanted to maintain the representation scheme used under the Articles, where each state receives equal representation in the national legislature. Neither plan compelled the opposition to give in. Fortunately, the delegation from Little Connecticut proposed what became known as the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise. Under this Great Compromise, we would get a bicameral legislature, as Virginia requested. The lower house would be directly elected, and representation would be based upon population, also in line with the Virginia plan. To balance the concerns of the smaller states, the second house would provide equal representation to all states, and members would be elected indirectly. There are several key principles in the United States Constitution that you need to understand. The first is federalism, the division of authority between the national and subnational governments. We're going to come back to this topic in detail a bit later. The U.S. Constitution is also based upon the notion of limited powers. That is, the government only has the authority to do things that are specifically listed in the U.S. Constitution. So there are three different sets of powers that you need to be familiar with. The first is enumerated powers. These are the powers delegated to the national government. This includes printing money, all of foreign affairs, regulating interstate commerce, and the like. Enumerated powers are those things that only the national government can do. The second type of powers that I want you to be familiar with are known as reserved powers. Reserved powers are those given to the states only. This includes issuing licenses and regulating commerce that occurs only within the state. And finally, there are what are known as concurrent powers. And these are those powers given to both the state and the national governments. So both the national government and the state governments can collect taxes, build roads, borrow money, operate court systems, etc. In addition to federalism and limited powers, the Constitution is also heavily reliant on this notion of separation of powers. So constitutional authority is divided among three branches. The legislature is primarily involved in making laws. The executive branch carries out or enforces the laws, and the judiciary makes rulings on laws. So the notion of separation of powers is this idea that each branch of government has their own job. Similarly, the United States Constitution has this notion of checks and balances. Checks and balances are related to separation of powers, but it is a distinct concept. Checks and balances means that constitutional authority is shared among the three branches. While each branch has its own job, each is also involved in developing policy. So, the legislature may write the laws, the executive handles the bureaucratic rulemaking, the judicial branch interprets and declares policies unconstitutional. This notion of separation of powers and checks and balances helps ensure that no single branch of the government becomes too strong. Those arguing in support of the ratification or the adoption of the new Constitution were known as Federalists. A few Federalists took it upon themselves to write a series of articles in support of the Constitution. These articles became known as the Federalist Papers. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay together wrote under the pseudonym Publius. They published the Federalist Papers in New York newspapers between October of 1787 and May of 1788. Final ratification of the U.S. Constitution occurred in 1789. We know which author wrote most of the papers, but scholars are still arguing about some of the papers. And there are a total of 85 Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers argued for a stronger national government than the one under the Articles, and for the ratification of the new Constitution. The Federalist Papers explain the structure of the new government and why it is the best solution to the new country's problems. Those who opposed the ratification of the U.S. Constitution were known as the Anti-Federalists, and they wrote their own set of papers and saw themselves the true heirs of the Revolution. These men were not quacks. They were notable men of their time. Patrick Henry, Thomas Paine, and George Mason all considered themselves Anti-Federalists. They didn't believe that a republican form of government could work in a large nation, and they didn't believe the rights of the individuals were sufficiently protected, and demanded a Bill of Rights be added to the Constitution. Under the Articles of Confederation, changes could only be made with unanimous consent of all 13 states. The men writing the U.S. Constitution knew that there was no way they were going to get unanimous consent, leading to the requirement of 9 states. As it turns out, this was good. North Carolina and Rhode Island initially rejected the Constitution, and a few states ratified only after they were promised that a Bill of Rights would be added immediately. In 1788, 9 states had ratified the U.S. Constitution, and eventually all 13 signed on. George Washington took office as the first President of the United States in April of 1789. The fight was not completely over, however, as now the first Congress had to address the issue of designing the promised Bill of Rights. One of the reasons the Anti-Federalists were against the ratification of the Constitution was that they believed the document failed to adequately protect individual liberties from government tyranny. Now, if both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists were so preoccupied with the idea of individual liberty, why didn't they add the Bill of Rights from the start? The idea was mentioned several times during the Constitutional Convention, but each time it was rejected. And why is that? First, the framers of the new Constitution believed that they were creating a government with limited authority. They believed that the U.S. Constitution was explicit enough to limit the activity of the national government to the appropriate areas of public policy. There was significant concern that if the framers tried to create a list of specific rights, that they would inadvertently leave out something, leaving the door open for someone down the line to argue that the Constitution did not protect an individual right. The framers saw the Constitution as a document outlining a finite list of things the government could do. Everything else was left to the states and individuals. A second reason why the Bill of Rights was rejected during the Constitutional Convention was that most states already had a Bill of Rights in their state constitutions, and it was argued that this protection from the states was sufficient. And finally, the body of the Constitution does outline a number of individual protections. We'll come back to these in turn as we move to the U.S. Constitution, the Articles. But consider, the writ of habeas corpus cannot be suspended except in times of invasion or rebellion. No ex post facto laws can be passed by Congress, and no religious qualification for holding federal office can be imposed.